And a very warm welcome. You're joining us here at Hyde Park on Derana 24 tonight. And we're talking about elections and economic policy as we have a number of candidates, the highest in Sri Lanka's electoral history, contesting a presidential election, or those who have placed deposits to contest the presidential election. And some significant members, prominent members of political parties who are promising varied economic policy measures, policy reversal, new policies, new laws, and to discuss what really is viable for Sri Lanka and feasible for Sri Lanka's economic development process and progress ahead beyond the next few decades. We've invited to our studios economist Talal Rafi, consultant economic policy for the ADB and expert member for the World Economic Forum, also joining here, who's more interested in development economics. Talal, let's start off talking about Sri Lanka and beyond. What is Sri Lanka's situation currently? We faced an economic crisis and a number of policies have been brought in. We went to the IMF to seek more of a bailout from this crisis. And now we're looking at an election, a crucial election for the country. But we have, as I said, a number of candidates who are promising different economic policy measures. And people are wondering what to go with.
Right. Thank you very much, Indeewari, for having me. So starting off to explain the situation in Sri Lanka, I would say that we are at a very critical juncture. So as in most countries, like for example, taking India or Thailand or many other countries, this crisis was an opportunity to do the hard reforms. So right now, as we stand with the elections, I mean, whoever is elected could take the country towards different paths. Some could take it to prosperity, some in a middle direction. But just to sum it up where we are, as the debt restructuring has shown us, that we have a sort of a slight breathing space till 2028. That is when most of the payments will start coming in. So in that brief time, it's a very short time, that'll fast evaporate. We need to do the reforms so that we can have the economy ready for 2028 when most of the repayments will come in. Mm-hmm. So, and we can sort of kick off and be ready for the coming decade, mm-hmm. which could be tough.
That's 2028.
2028, 2029. So the thing is that if we don't do the reforms and if we just be as we are right now, of course the country was in a bad situation. Thanks to the IMF program, there is some sort of stability achieved, but we cannot continue this way for the next 4 years. Mm-hmm. So this is a sort of a breathing space where we need to do most of the reforms, especially when it comes to revenue generation, the SOE reforms, and most importantly, the trade reforms. Mm-hmm.
Now, with the IMF agreement, we have had creditor assurances from bilateral creditors as well as other partners, including the Paris Club. But here we have candidates who are promising a reversal of economic policy, reversal from the IMF agreement and renegotiation. Some say we will completely do away with the IMF, while there are laws now that are looking at policy implementation. So what does it mean for a country like Sri Lanka if either of this happens?
So, of course, starting off, I don't think we can go without an IMF program because most of the debt restructuring agreements with most of the creditors, everything depends on that. So if those go away, this country, we could very well be back to square one. That's 2022. Mm-hmm. So the other two options are, of course, continue this way, but also as proposed, amend the IMF program to a certain extent.
But is that possible?
That should be possible, at least from what we hear from the IMF. So because, just to explain it, the current path we are doing is, I mean, I don't think it's structured towards growth. This was an IMF program that was drafted in 2022. Mm-hmm. So that was, like, even if you look at most of the IMF baselines.
Yeah. But when you say it's not structured towards growth, what is the program focusing on?
So the program is mostly focused on bringing stability. So that was the primary goal.
Isn't that what Sri Lanka requires?
Yes, that is what we require. And I think, of course, stability is something that's needed in the next 10 years, maybe. I mean, we always need macroeconomic stability is something that is a given, that should be there. That's the base. But we need to grow beyond. So there are certain things like, for example, by what I mean by amending the IMF program is like not on the major benchmarks, but on how we do it. Like, for example, the tax slabs. Like anybody earning over 300,000 rupees, that's basically most of the professionals in Colombo. They come in above that is in the highest tax slab. So even if you look at the richest person in Sri Lanka, I mean, they pay basically the same rates. So in this sort of an environment, we also need to keep our businesses intact. Right? We are going to be in a position to come out of this crisis. Or if we just go on the path of stability, of course, that's the bare minimum, we can, of course, run into another crisis.
Is it wise for Sri Lanka to look at growth, target growth? You spoke about the IMF agreement, which was designed in 2022 at the depth of the crisis when Sri Lanka plunged into a deep crisis. At that time and even now, is it viable for Sri Lanka to look at policies that that take the country towards growth before stabilizing the economy, or should we go on this path of stability for the next 10 years or so, as you said, and then look at a growth strategy?
Sure, yes. So answering the question, when I say moving towards an export-oriented economy, it doesn't mean that we have to move away from stability. Of course, we need to have the macroeconomic stability is much needed. Of course, we cannot become an export-oriented economy with fast growth while having inflation up, or while the interest rates are up, or where we have shortages of essential items. So, of course, debt sustainability, everything has to be kept in place. But what I'm talking about is that there are other ways to achieve debt sustainability. One thing is, of course, grow the economy. So then, we can achieve the 95% that's required by 2032. But at the same time, also balancing the fiscal side. Like, for example, just to give an example of Japan. Like our debt to GDP ratio right now is 115%. And, people say it's high. And of course, it is because our interest costs are high. But if you look at, for example, Japan's debt to GDP ratio is 250% of GDP. But ours is only 115%. But 70% of our government revenue goes to paying interest. But even though Japan has almost double the amount of debt when compared to GDP, only 6% of Japan's government revenue goes to paying interest rates. There's two reasons for that. One is our government revenue is just around 11% of GDP. Japan's is at 37%. So they have quite high government revenue. And the second thing is the borrowing costs. I mean, for Japan to borrow, it's less than 1%. I think last when I checked, a 10-year bond is around 0.88%. So the borrowing costs are very low. So in order to achieve that, even if we keep the debt at over 100%, we can bring down the interest payments, which are costing us a lot of money, by getting the fiscal side this thing. So that's why the IMF has put in the 2.3% primary budget surplus that's required. And a point that I always emphasize is that we've only achieved 5 times in 75 years a primary budget surplus. That is expenditure minus revenue minus the interest payments. And when it comes to expenditure minus revenue, I don't think we have ever achieved it in 75 years. So obviously the financial...
Is it possible for us to achieve?
At the moment, we are struggling with achieving a 2.3% primary budget surplus, taking away the interest payments. So if you are going to take interest payments also into account, I think we've got a long way to go.
You spoke about growing the economy.
Yes.
A number of strategies, policies have been discussed. Some say we have to go towards a service economy. Some say manufacturing. You mentioned now about an export economy as well. That has been the discussion for many years now. and some say we have to look at, other revenue generating mechanisms as well. Whatever it is that is promised or discussed, what in your view is the most feasible economic policy or growth method for Sri Lanka?
For Sri Lanka, as I've said, the first thing is I think we need to, when we look about increasing exports, we have to focus on how the world works. The problem in Sri Lanka is that we look at what we have. And we're like, we have rubber, we have tea, and, we just have to find the buyer. So it should be looked at the other way. What does the world need? So what most people fail to realize is that 70% of global trade is supplying global value chains. So that is like an example would be maybe supplying a certain part that is in Samsung's supply chain or Apple's, or even services like Microsoft may need something that's done here, a sort of a niche thing in developing a software. So that is where about 70% of the trade is. It's not like those days, I mean, like you manufacture everything inside a country and export. Nowadays, like a lot of multinational companies look at like down to the last cent where it would be cheaper to. So if, for example, Toyota, and I think there's one entrepreneur in Sri Lanka who's doing it, making sensors for cars, and that is an example of how we can do it. Like find out the multinationals, what is their niche, what they need, and if we can see if we can have a comparative advantage. I mean, this is the method that's been successful for most. Like, for example, if you look at Southeast Asia and South Asia is fast developing. I mean, the tiger economy is what they call. Because if you look at Southeast Asia, it's mostly intra-industry trade. So most of the exports and imports within those countries, like, for example, between South Korea and Singapore, or, for example, Malaysia and Hong Kong, would all be inside a certain industry. So when the final product may be coming from Malaysia, but most of the parts would have come from Thailand, Hong Kong, and it's very competitive. So I think Sri Lanka, for example, one thing we can do is like work on these niche, and India is a fast growing area. Like, for example, especially South India, Tamil Nadu is probably the second most industrial state. So there are possibilities if we can collaborate on maybe getting certain parts of supply chains outsourced.
We're also talking about SOE reforms as a major policy reformation in Sri Lanka's path to prosperity. What is your view here, especially because with elections around the corner, state-owned enterprises become a key topic of discussion at campaign rallies as well. But these state-owned enterprises which are not performing well, that have been a burden to the economy, there is something that needs to be done to derive the maximum out of these resources and the kind of inputs that the government is making to run and keep these entities running. But in comparison to other nations that have really ventured through this issue, what do you think work for Sri Lanka?
So for Sri Lanka, in my personal opinion, would be we need to look at each SOE on an individual basis. But as far as state-owned enterprises go, just to give a stat, about 10% of Sri Lanka's GDP goes to just maintaining the public sector. So, for example, in 2022, a minister, quoting a minister, he was saying 86% of government revenue went to paying only salaries and pensions of state sector workers. So, of course, this is quite a large portion because just to give another stat, for example, we see the middle income trap. So countries usually coming from a low income countries to middle income, usually people move from the agricultural sector to the towns, they start working in factories. That's what China did. But if we are going to transition to a developed country, we need to work on innovation. So a large amount of money, for example, if you look at Israel or South Korea, 6% of GDP goes to research and development alone. So that's the level, like an example is, for example, Israel doesn't have steel, nor does it have rubber, but it still manufactures tires for some of the largest aeroplanes in the world. So that is because they've focused so much on research and development that they have the technical know-how. So coming back to the topic, it's like a large portion of the government's revenue is being redirected towards a sector that many claim that does not give the return. Like even in my work, I would say that if you look at the public sector worker, you'd be surprised that people there are a lot of vacancies at the top. Like at the senior level, there are vacancies. It's usually very crowded out at the bottom. That is because at the senior level, one thing is most people don't want to work or don't feel comfortable to work because of so much is, there's like nearly 1.5 million people working there. So there's barely enough to pay the people at the top. So they would much rather work in the private sector or move abroad. So what would be thing is to rationalize expenditure, to see wherever possible if we can sort of downsize it. But at the same time, I'm always an advocate for increasing the salaries of the people at the top, or even when it's downsized. I generally think that government servants need to be paid more than they are to get
and
the
made
best
more
out of
efficient.
Sure. And yes. So especially like there are sectors we need to spend a lot on. For example, the education sector. There, I mean, one of the reasons why, for a good example would be coming from a development economic background, like South Korea. I mean, when they wanted to develop, what they did was they focused a lot on education. Education, especially vocational training. They knew that they wanted to go into manufacturing, and they had the sort of vocational institutes ready to put people out. A large emphasis on STEM education. Here, I've also worked on some education reforms. Here we find that, for example, Sri Lanka ranks very high on arts and humanities, even in universities. And let's not forget that only 1 in 10 students passing A-levels can get into a university
in Sri Lanka.
And it's a very small portion that come out as STEM graduates, which is absolutely essential if you are going to transform. So even if you look at a statistic per million, India produces 8 times more STEM graduates than Sri Lanka. So here,
yeah, but you have an engineering background as well, and you spoke about STEM graduates. Sri Lanka's brain drain scenario is really also among STEM graduates, professionals representing these key areas. So how does this really affect Sri Lanka's growth prospects going forward? Because we're looking at a key phase in Sri Lanka's economy, a juncture where you need all the brains, important decisions made and utilized in driving economic growth. So how do you think this should be strategically addressed?
So yeah, just a thing that I started off as an engineering, but I didn't graduate. I moved out. So coming back, it affects a lot because if you look at most of the, for example, look at the US. I mean, they say Silicon Valley is the best place for entrepreneurship. A lot of countries, including Dubai, Russia, they sent in their people to study Silicon Valley and get back. And they couldn't because one thing was a number of factors. One is the culture, but most importantly, it's also that Stanford was there. It was the University of Stanford being in the middle of Silicon Valley was like the engine of growth because it pumped out the graduates in the needed field. So here in Sri Lanka, when you look at, for example, certain stats, I don't have the numbers, we find that a portion studies A-levels, but between 19 and 24, most of them are neither studying, neither training, neither working. And when you look deeper into this, the reason is because even though they graduate, they come out with the skills that the industry doesn't need. So that's why, I mean, yesterday I was reading a former central bank employee was stating that if you're a graduate and you come out, your salary is like 40 or 50,000 rupees at the moment. So it's also a sort of a disincentive, for example, for women to work in because there's a lot of sacrifices more than men for them to come into the workforce. And when you're like at the beginning told that this is your salary, then they tend to just lose faith. So here again, what is needed is, I would say that the number one thing that we need to focus on, especially for schools, is career guidance. Every student that's doing an A-levels, they need to be able to speak to a person who will guide them on, because in Sri Lanka the culture is, you're either a doctor, engineer, accountant, lawyer. Usually parents don't know much beyond that. So there are fields which can earn a lot of money, like cybersecurity. I did a sort of an article which was published in the Hindu in India on cybersecurity. We found that globally, the amount, I forgot the exact numbers, but whatever is put out, the number of graduates on cybersecurity, the demand is almost 2 to 3 times more. So there's a huge demand in these areas, high paying. So that was an answer earlier. Previously, you asked whether we should focus on manufacturing or services. I would say that services would be a better alternative. Because if I may elaborate on this, people tend to give the example of China coming up. But then when China opened its economy and was, got work outsourced from the West, it was only competing with the high wage of the US and Europe. But today, if Sri Lanka does everything right and wants to go into the manufacturing sector, we're already competing with Bangladesh, with Vietnam, with China. Bangladesh has lower wages than us. China has the infrastructure. So I'm not saying manufacturing is bad. Of course, if we can find something on the comparative, where we have a comparative advantage, or where we can find a niche in the supply chains, that's fine. But our strength would naturally be in the services sector. We have companies that are doing amazing jobs for Western multilaterals.
As you stress on the services sector, what laws and regulations should we bring in to shape the industries or graduation into a more revenue-generating industry for Sri Lanka? Because there are areas, we even speak about IT, BPO sectors, which can generate a massive amount of revenue for Sri Lanka with our incentives that can be given to, with the labor market, to the high the knowledge capacity that the Sri Lankan labor market has. So what laws and regulations do you think should be brought in to support this way forward?
So I think the laws, those are one thing. We have everything in place, at least according to my knowledge. But what is needed is, in my opinion, more collaborations with like regional countries. For example, with India, that is one sector where we can do a lot of collaboration. Some of the largest firms are in India. Like, for example, if you look at a certain Indian multinational that's come here, that's created thousands of jobs. So here again, as I mentioned, rather than laws, I would say that we need to get the supply going. Because one thing, at least some of the experts that I talk in the industry say that it's like coming back to the topic, it's a lack of like STEM graduates. Those are the supply is less. So that is a reason. Otherwise, Sri Lanka, as everyone says, has amazing talent. As you can see, though we are a tiny country, a small country, at least in the global picture, we have people who have done a lot. So a Sri Lankan was involved in the founding of Facebook. A Sri Lankan was a chief economist of the World Bank. So the talent is here. If we can just, about 9 out of 10 Sri Lankans leaving school don't get a spot in the university. Why can't we have private universities?
So education and investment are key here. You spoke about how we can invest or collaborate with multinationals or maybe big major companies in India especially. But in order to engage and collaborate with these companies, we have to have a sound framework here, a business environment here. After the crisis, the business environment has been challenging for even businesses, local businesses operating in the country. Earlier on, you discussed about the tax structure and how businesses should be protected. But how does this work? Especially there are professionals who are complaining about the tax structure, higher taxes. Sri Lankans were not used to this level of taxation. But again, you require that level of taxation for revenue generation, but is that equally distributed among the high-earning groups and the middle-income earners, the professionals? How do we very carefully and strategically address this question?
So that's always a challenge. I mean, for example, why we are in this situation is because we didn't get the revenues right for so many years. As I mentioned, we never balanced our budget for 7 decades. So here again, what we need to do is not have the high tax rates, which is leading to a brain drain, and many professionals or investments are shy of coming here, to broaden the tax base. Like, for example, I think a couple of years ago, they were saying there were only 60,000 active files, personal income tax files. For a country of 22 million, I mean, that is very, very low. So if we can broaden it, and if the people who are supposed to pay can start paying, then we can drastically reduce it. So because not collecting the amount of money from where it should be coming, like from wealthy people who should be paying the
How do you target those who should be paying taxes more?
I think, I mean, there are a number of other things like digital, but at the same time, if you ask me quite honestly, the government also, it'll do a great favor if the government can also show that the money, the tax that is being paid is being used very well. That will encourage a lot of people to pay. Coming back to the reason, when I say taxes are not being collected, it also means that because of that, we have to rely a lot on duties, custom duties and others. So that keeps the economy sort of like, they say Sri Lanka is one of the closest, the most closed economies in the world. So that puts a brake on being an export-oriented economy. Like, for example, when we put tariffs, like, for example, let's take vehicles. When we put so much tariffs, the vehicle prices go up. So that means the person who is hiring a vehicle, who owns a lorry or a commercial vehicle, he has to pay a much higher lease to buy that vehicle. So obviously, when he rents it out to a business, he has to charge more. So the overall costs go up. So at the same time, other things, like, for example, if we can, in my opinion, for us to increase our exports, we need to become a competitive economy. Like, an example is like potatoes or sugar. Most of these you can import it from India. So includes many other products, like industrial products. But what we don't is we try to manufacture everything inside our country. So that means that Sri Lanka is a very limited country. I mean, 22 million people, limited resources. When we go into producing unproductive products, the consumer is getting a higher price, lower quality. So an example would be Chile. The country opened its economy. What it did was, it did not even negotiate FTAs. It just put a flat out 6% tariff rate for any country. And it signed agreements. It has one of the highest number of FTAs in the world. So when I was talking to an economist from Chile, when I was working at Deloitte, so she was saying that what happened was, overnight, its garments industry, its footwear industry got wiped out. But new industries came out. After that point, they discovered that, you know, Chile had wine that could be sold. So, and you'll be surprised that people would expect that country to crash, but its exports started going up, if you look at the graph. So what that means is, when you open the economy, it means that every industry in Sri Lanka will try to be competitive, because they now have to compete with the global ones. So whoever cannot compete will shut down and will focus on industries that are competitive. So if you can stay in Sri Lanka and compete with imports, it also means that your products are good enough to be exported to other countries. So that's where the logic comes, like Singapore and many others do it. Yes.
But how do we empower small and medium enterprises also here? We have just a few minutes on the show, but small and medium enterprises, the engine of growth, the private sector as well, to not discourage, but empower the private sector to grow, the SMEs to continue to develop on their interests and their advantages.
So the SME sector is very important. I mean, for example, if I can just touch on entrepreneurship, Sri Lanka is one of the lowest amount of entrepreneurs as a percentage of population. So here again, we always blame politicians, you know, because over the years we have built up such a large public sector. But you can't blame it. Like if you go to a village, I mean, there are hardly any job opportunities. So the only job they can get is in a state sector. So the reason is because there's only one way you can grow as a country. That's the expanding of the private sector. So there are two ways. One is existing businesses should expand or new businesses should come up. So the encouragement of entrepreneurs. So here again, as somebody who has worked on this for a number of projects by multilaterals, I would say that a lot of factors get into being. One is the ease of doing business. Many people are discouraged. Many entrepreneurs I have spoken to are discouraged to come in because of some of the lengthy processes, regulations, all these. The other is access to finance. So here in Sri Lanka, banks ask for collateral. So you don't have that sort of cash flow based lending. I mean, this has improved in India because of the Aadhaar system, the UPI system, because whenever anybody spends there, it's in a record. In Sri Lanka, people don't have a financial record or a cash flow record. So therefore, collateral is always missing. And also generally, something that I feel in Sri Lanka is that we are, as a whole, we don't generally, even businesses, don't tend to want investments. They would rather have a loan and keep full control of the company rather than take investments. So these are some of the changes that would be absolutely essential. And also, lastly, the ecosystem needs to be there. Like everything which a digitized system where we can open a company. I mean, New Zealand ranks #1 on ease of doing business. It takes half a day to register a company. In Sri Lanka, it takes 2 weeks on paper and almost a year to close down a company. So if I want to start a company, I'm just thinking that it's a long process to close one. So many people instead choose to be in an informal sector or not register a limited liability company, which in the end results in lower revenue for the government. So I think we should also focus a lot on formalizing the economy, make it cheaper for people to register limited liability companies, then you get added revenues.
And would all this be possible with political stability and policy consistency?
I think a government with a strong mandate, and the key factor is that, I mean, Sri Lanka is a country with, we know what has to be done, at least most of the people, but it's all about implementation. That's where the hurdles come in, because we have let this grow to such an extent that there'll always be pressure groups that will prevent this thing. Like, for example, just one point I would like to emphasize. People talk about countries that changed. I mean, China after 78, India after 91, Thailand after 97. If you look at what was India before 91 and after 91, there's just one factor. Their trade and investment policies changed. They just allowed imports. So as I mentioned before, the economy becomes competitive. But of course, this will be prevented. This is very, very difficult. Even though this is the absolute logical thing to do, it's difficult because you have local industrialists who have the lobbying power to prevent these things. But the exporters who will be empowered and who will come up due to these changes are not yet there to put lobby at the same level. So this has been the trouble, and this is in all the studies.
Just as India after 91
Yes,
and all
after
these
91.
other countries. Let's hope Sri Lanka's 2022 crisis, 2021 economic situation would be the turning point for Sri Lanka after 2024 to achieve growth like never before. Thank you. Thank you, Talal, for your time here at Hyde Park. Joining us tonight, we had expert member, World Economic Forum, consultant economic policy, ADB, economist Talal Rafi joining us to talk about Sri Lanka's economic prospects as campaigning for the election is to begin. We'll see you again next week with yet another discussion here at Hyde Park on Other Derana 24. Have a pleasant evening. Good night.